Part 15 of the Book of the National Parks. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Book of the National Parks by Robert Sterling Yard. Yellowstone, a Volcanic Interlude. Wyoming, northwestern Wyoming. Area 3,348 square miles. 1. John Coulter's story of hot springs at the upper waters of the Yellowstone River was laughed at by the public of 1810. Jim Bridger's account of the geysers in the 30s made his national reputation as a liar. Warren Angus Ferris's description of the upper geyser basin was received in 1842 in unbelieving silence. Later explorers who sought the Yellowstone to test the truth of these tales thought it wholesome to keep their findings to themselves, as magazines and newspapers refused to publish their accounts, and lecturers were stoned in the streets as impostors. It required the authority of the semi-official Washburn-Langford expedition of 1869 to establish credence. The original appeal of the Yellowstone, that to wonder, remains its most popular appeal today, though science has dissipated mystery these many years. Many visitors, I am persuaded, enjoy the wonder of it more even than the spectacle. I have heard people refuse to listen to the explanation of geyser action, lest it lessen their pleasure in Old Faithful. I confess to moods in which I want to see the blue flames and smell the brimstone which Jim Bridger describes so eloquently. There are places where it is not hard to imagine both. For many years the uncanny wonders of a dying volcanic region absorbed the public mind to the exclusion of all else in the Yellowstone neighborhood, which Congress, principally in consequence of these wonders, made a national park in 1872. Yet all the time it possessed two other elements of distinction, which a later period regards as equal to the volcanic phenomena, elements, in fact, of such distinction that either one alone, without the geysers, would have warranted the reservation of so striking a region for a national park. One of these is the valley of the Yellowstone River, with its spectacular waterfalls and its colorful canyon. The other is its population of wild animals, which, in 1872, probably was as large and may have been larger than today's. Yet little was heard of the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone in those days, although Moran's celebrated painting, now in the Capitol at Washington, helped influence Congress to make it a national park, and so little did the wild animals figure in the calculations of the period that they were not even protected in the national park until 1894, when hunting had reduced the buffalo to 25 animals. Even in these days of enlightenment and appreciation, the great majority of people think of the Yellowstone only as an area enclosing geysers. There are tourists so possessed with this idea that they barely glance at the canyon in passing. I have heard tourists refuse to walk to Inspiration Point because they had already looked over the rim at a convenient and unimpressive place. Imagine coming 2,000 miles to balk at 2 miles and a half to the only spectacle of its kind in the world, and one of the world's great spectacles at that. As for the animals, few indeed see any but the occasional bears that feed at the hotel dumps in the evening. The Yellowstone National Park lies in the recesses of the Rocky Mountains in northwestern Wyoming. It slightly overlaps Montana on the north and northwest, and Idaho on the southwest. It is rectangular, with an entrance about the middle of each side. It is the largest of the national parks, enclosing 3,348 square miles. It occupies a high plain girt with mountains. The Absarokas bound it on the east, their crest invading the park at Mount Chittenden. The Gallatin Range pushes into the northwestern corner from the north. The Continental Divide crosses the southwestern corner over the lofty Madison Plateau and the ridge south of Yellowstone Lake. Altitudes are generally high. The plains range from 6,000 to 8,000 feet. The mountains rise occasionally to 10,000 feet. South of the park, the Pitchstone Plateau merges into the foothills of the Teton Mountains, which 30 miles south of the southern boundary rise precipitously 7,000 feet above the general level of the country. Though occupying the heart of the Rocky Mountains, the region is not of them. In no sense is it typical. The Rockies are essentially granite, which was forced molten from the depths when, at the creation of this vast central mountain system, lateral pressures lifted the earth's skin high above sea level, folded it, and finally eroded it along the crest of the folds. In this granite system, the Yellowstone is a volcanic interlude, and of much later date. It belongs in a general way to the impulse of volcanic agitation which lighted vast beacons over 300,000 square miles of our northwest. The Cascade Mountains belong in this grouping. 4 national parks of today were then in the making: Mount Rainier in Washington, Crater Lake in Oregon, Lassen Volcanic in California, and the Yellowstone in Wyoming. Subterranean heat, remaining from those days of volcanic activity, today boils the water which the geysers hurl in air. In the northeastern part of the Yellowstone, a large central crater was surrounded by smaller volcanoes. You can easily trace the conformation from Mount Washburn, which stood upon its southeastern rim, heaped there, doubtless, by some explosion of more than common violence. This volcanic period was of long duration, perhaps hundreds of thousands of years. In the northeastern part of the park, the erosion of a hill has exposed the petrified remains of 13 large forests in layers, one on top of the other, the deep intervening spaces filled with thick deposits of ashes. 13 consecutive times were great forests here smothered in the products of eruption. 13 times did years enough elapse between eruptions for soil to make and forests to grow again, each perhaps of many generations of great trees. Yellowstone's mountains, then, are decayed volcanoes. Its rock is lava, its soil is ash and disintegrated lava. The resulting outline is soft and waving, with a tendency to levels. There are no pinnacled heights, no stratified, minareted walls, no precipiced cirques and glacier-shrouded peaks. Yet glaciers visited the region. The large granite boulder brought from afar and left near the west rim of the Grand Canyon, with thousands of feet of rhyolite and other products of volcanism beneath it, is alone sufficient proof of that. Between the periods from volcano to glacier and from glacier to today, stream erosion has performed its miracles. The volcanoes have been rounded and flattened. The plateaus have been built up and leveled, and the canyons of the Yellowstone, Gibbon, and Madison rivers have been dug. Vigorous as its landscape still remains, it has thus become the natural playground for a multitude of people unaccustomed to the rigors of a powerfully accented mountain country. The fact is that, in spite of its poverty of peaks and precipices, the Yellowstone country is one of the most varied and beautiful wildernesses in the world. Among national parks it gains rather than loses by its difference. While easily penetrated, it is wild in the extreme, hinting of the prairies in its broad opens, pasture for thousands of wild ruminants, and of the loftier mountains in its distant ranges, its isolated peaks, and its groups of rugged rolling summits. In the number, magnitude, and variety of its waters, it stands quite alone. It contains no less than 3 watersheds of importance, those of the Yellowstone, Madison, and Snake rivers, flowing respectively north, west, and south. The waters of the Yellowstone and Madison make it an important source of the Missouri. There are minor rivers of importance in the park, and innumerable lesser streams. It is a network of waterways. Its waterfalls are many, and 2 of them are large and important. Its lakes are many, and several are large. Yellowstone Lake is the largest of its altitude in the world. As a wilderness, therefore, the Yellowstone is unequaled. Its innumerable waters ensure the luxuriance of its growths. Its forested parts are densely forested, its flower gardens are unexcelled in range, color, and variety, and its meadows grow deep in many kinds of rich grass. If it were only for the splendor of its wilderness, it still would be worth the while. Imagine this wilderness heavily populated with friendly wild animals, sprinkled with geysers, hot springs, mud volcanoes, painted terraces, and petrified groves, sensational with breathtaking canyons and waterfalls, penetrable over hundreds of miles of well-built road and several times the mileage of trails, and comfortable because of its large hotels and public camps, located conveniently for its enjoyment, and you have a pleasure ground of extraordinary quality. Remember that one may camp out almost anywhere, and that all waters are trout waters. Yellowstone offers the best fishing easily accessible in the continent. Another advantage possessed by the Yellowstone is a position near the center of the country among great railroad systems. The Northern Pacific reaches it on the north, the Burlington on the east, and the Union Pacific on the west. One can take it coming or going between oceans. It is possible to buy tickets in by any one railroad and out by either of the others. An elaborate system of automobile coaches swings the passenger where he pleases, meeting all incoming trains and delivering at all outgoing trains. It is much easier now to see the Yellowstone than in the much vaunted stagecoach times previous to 1915, times solely lamented by the romantic, because their passing meant the passing of the picturesque old horse-drawn stagecoach from its last stand in the United States, times when a tour of the Yellowstone meant 6½ days of slow, dusty travel, starting early and arriving late, with a few minutes or hours at each site for the soiled and exhausted traveler to gape in ignorant wonder, watch in hand. Today one travels swiftly and comfortably in entire leisure, stopping at hotels or camps as he pleases, and staying at each as long as he likes. The runs between the lingering places are now a pleasure. If hurried, one can now accomplish the stagecoach trip of the past in 2 days, while the old 6½ days now means a leisurely and delightful visit. With the new order of travel began a new conception of the Yellowstone's public usefulness. It ceased to be a museum of wonders and began to be a summer pleasure ground. Instead of the fast automobile stage decreasing the average length of visit, the new idea which it embodied has lengthened it. This new idea is a natural evolution which began with the automobile and spread rapidly. The railroads have been bringing tourists principally on transcontinental stopovers. Automobiles brought people who came really to see the Yellowstone, who stayed weeks at public camps to see it, or who brought outfits and camped out among its spectacles. The first Ford which entered the park on the morning of August 1, 1915, the day when private cars were first admitted, so loaded with tenting and cooking utensils that the occupants scarcely could be seen, was the herald of the new and greater Yellowstone. Those who laughed and those who groaned at the sight of it, and there were both, were no seers, for that minute Yellowstone entered upon her destiny. The road scheme is simple and effective. From each entrance a road leads into an oblong loop road enclosing the center of the park and touching the principal points of scenic interest. This loop is connected across the middle for convenience. From it several short roads push out to special spectacles, and a long road follows Lamar Creek through a northeastern entrance to a mining town which has no other means of communication with the world outside. This is the road to Specimen Ridge, with its 13 engulfed forests, to the Buffalo Range, and outside the park boundaries to the Grasshopper Glacier, in whose glassy embrace may be seen millions of grasshoppers, which have lain in very cold storage, indeed, from an age before man. All are automobile roads. 2. The hot water phenomena are scattered over a large area of the park. The Mammoth Hot Springs at the northern entrance are the only active example of a high terrace building. The geysers are concentrated in 3 adjoining groups upon the middle west side. But hot springs occur everywhere at widely separated points. A steam jet is seen emerging even from the depths of the Grand Canyon, 1,000 feet below the rim. The traveler is never long allowed to forget, in the silent beauty of the supreme wilderness, the park's uncanny nature. Suddenly encountered columns of steam rising from innocent meadows, occasional half-acres of dead and discolored brush emerging from hot and yellow mud-holes within the glowing forest heart, an unexpected roaring hillside running with smoking water, irregular agitated pools of gray, pink, or yellow mud, spitting like a pot of porridge, explosive puffs of steam, the warm vaporing of a shallow in a cold forest-bound lake, a continuous violent bellowing from the depths of a ragged roadside hole which at intervals vomits noisily quantities of thick brown and purple liquid, occasional groups of richly colored hot springs in an acre or more of dull yellows, the whole steaming vehemently and interchanging the pinks and blues of its hot waters as the passing traveler changes his angle of vision. These and other uncouth phenomena in wide variety and frequent repetition enliven the tourist's way. They are more numerous in geyser neighborhoods, but some of them are met singly, always with a little shock of surprise, in every part of the park. The terrace-building springs in the north of the park engulf trees. The bulky, growing mounds of white and gray deposit are edged with minutely carven basins, mounted upon elaborately fluted supports of ornate design, over whose many-colored edges flows a shimmer of hot water. Basin rises upon basin, tier upon tier, each in turn destined to clog and dry and merge into the mass, while new basins and new tiers form and grow and glow awhile upon their outer flank. The material, of course, is precipitated by the water when it emerges from the earth's hot interior. The vivid yellows and pinks and blues in which these terraces clothe themselves upon warm days result from minute vegetable algae, which thrive in the hot, saturated lime water, but quickly die and fade to gray and shining white on drying. The height of some of these shapeless masses of terrace-built structures is surprising, but more surprising yet is the vividness of color assumed by the limpid springs in certain lights and at certain angles. Climbing the terraces at the expense of wet feet, one stands upon broad, white, and occasionally very damp plateaus which steam vigorously in spots. These spots are irregularly circular and very shallow pools of hot water, some of which bubble industriously with a low, pleasant hum. They are not boiling springs. The bubbling is caused by escaping gases, but their waters are extremely hot. The intense color of some of these pools varies or disappears with the changing angle of vision. The water itself is limpid. Elsewhere throughout the park the innumerable hot springs seem to be less charged with depositable matter. Elsewhere they build no terraces, but bubble joyously up through bowls often many feet in depth and diameter. Often they are inspiringly beautiful. The blue Morning Glory spring is jewel-like rather than flower-like in its color quality, but its bowl remarkably resembles the flower which gives it name. Most springs are gloriously green. Some are the sources of considerable streams. Some stir slightly with the feeling rather than the appearance of life. Others are perpetually agitated, several small springs betraying their relationship to the geysers by a periodicity of activity. When the air is dry and the temperature low, the springs shoot thick volumes of steam high in the air. To the incomer by the north or west entrance who has yet to see a geyser, the first view of the lower geyser basin gives a shock of astonishment, no matter what his expectation. Let us hope it is a cool, bracing, breezy morning when the broad yellow plain emits hundreds of columns of heavy steam, to unite in a wind-tossed cloud, overlying and settling on the uncanny spectacle. Several geysers spout vehemently, and one or more roaring vents bellow like angry bulls in a nightmare. This is appropriately the introduction to the greater geyser basins which lie nearby upon the south. Who shall describe the geysers? What pen, what brush, shall do justice to their ghostly glory, the eager vehemence of their assaults upon the sky, their joyful gush and roar, their insistence upon conscious personality and power, the white majesty of their fluted columns at the instant of fullest expansion, the supreme loveliness of their feathery fluorescence at the level of poise between rise and fall, their graciousness of form, their speedy airiness of action, their giant convolutions of sun-flecked steam rolling aloft in ever-expanding volume to rejoin the parent cloud. Perhaps there have been greater geyser basins somewhere in the prehistoric past. There may be greater still to come. One or two promising possibilities are in Alaska. But for the lapse of geologic time in which man has so far lived, Yellowstone has cornered the world's geyser market. There are only two other places where one may enjoy the spectacle of large geysers. One of these is New Zealand, and the other Iceland. But both displays combined cannot equal Yellowstone's either in the number or the size of the geysers. Yellowstone has dozens of geysers of many kinds. They range in size from the little spring that spurts a few inches every minute to the monster that hurls hundreds of tons of water 300 feet in the air every 6 or 8 weeks. Many spout at regular intervals of minutes or hours or days. Others are notably irregular, and these include most of the largest. Old Faithful won its name and reputation by its regularity. It is the only one of the group of monsters which lives up to its timetable. Its period ranges from intervals of about 55 minutes in seasons following winters of heavy snow to 80 or 85 minutes in seasons following winters of light snow. Its eruptions are announced in the Old Faithful Inn a few minutes in advance of action, and the population of the hotel walks out to see the spouting. At night a searchlight is thrown upon the gushing flood. After all, Old Faithful is the most satisfactory of geysers. Several are more imposing. Sometimes enthusiasts remain in the neighborhood for weeks, waiting for the giant to play, and dare not venture far away for fear of missing the spectacle, while Old Faithful, which is quite as beautiful and nearly as large, performs hourly for the pleasure of thousands. Even the most hurried visitor to the upper basin is sure, between stages, of seeing several geysers in addition to one or more performances of Old Faithful. The greatest of known geysers ceased playing in 1888. I have found no authentic measurements or other stated records concerning the famous Excelsior. It hurled aloft an enormous volume of water, with a fury of action described as appalling. Posterity is fortunate in the existence of a striking photograph of this monster taken at the height of its play by F. J. Haynes, then official photographer of the park. The first photographs I made were in the fall of 1881, Mr. Haynes writes me. The eruptions continued during the winter at increasing intervals from 2 hours, when the series began, to 4 hours when it ceased operations before the tourist season of 1882. Not having the modern photographic plates for instantaneous work in 1881, it was impossible to secure instantaneous views then, but in the spring of 1888 I made the view which you write about. It was taken at the fullness of its eruption. The explosion was preceded by a rapid filling of the crater and a great overflow of water. The column was about 50 feet wide and came from the center of the crater. Pieces of formation were torn loose and were thrown out during each eruption. Large quantities eventually were removed from the crater, thus enlarging it to its present size. Here we have a witness's description of the process which clouds the career of the Excelsior Geyser. The enlargement of the vent eventually gave unrestrained passage to the imprisoned steam. The geyser ceased to play. Today, the Excelsior Spring is one of the largest hot springs in the Yellowstone and the world. Its output of steaming water is constant and voluminous. Thus again we find relationship between the hot spring and the geyser. It is apparent that the same vent, except perhaps for differences of internal shaping, might serve for both. It was the removal of restraining walls which changed the Excelsior Geyser to the Excelsior Spring. For many years geyser action remained a mystery, balanced among conflicting theories, of which at last Bunsen's won general acceptance. Spring waters or surface waters seeping through porous lavas gather thousands of feet below the surface in some pocket located in strata which internal pressures still keep hot. Boiling as they gather, the waters rise till they fill the long vent hole to the surface. Still the steam keeps making in the deep pocket, where it is held down by the weight of the water in the vent above. As it accumulates, this steam compresses more and more. The result is inevitable. There comes a moment when the expansive power of the compressed steam overcomes the weight above. Explosion follows. The steam, expanding now with violence, drives the water up the vent and out, nor is it satisfied until the vent is emptied. Upon the surface, as the geyser lapses and dies, the people turn away to the inn and luncheon. Under the surface, again the waters gather and boil in preparation for the next eruption. The interval till then will depend upon the amount of water which reaches the deep pocket, the size of the pocket, and the length and shape of the vent hole. If conditions permit the upward escape of steam as fast as it makes in the pocket, we have a hot spring. If the steam makes faster than it can escape, we have a geyser. End of Part 15.